President Donald Trump's tariffs have spooked investors, wiping out $4 trillion in market value from the S&P 500.
More than $5 trillion in value had been wiped from the markets in just 3 weeks. More money than the GDP of every country on earth other than the U.S. and China.
The S&P just slightly higher right now. The Dow down more than 100 points. The Nasdaq coming off its worst day since 2022.
The stock market is getting wrecked. Tariffs are hammering U.S. businesses, but President Trump is still not stopping. On April 2nd, every nation that trades with the U.S. was forced to make a choice: either accept new tariffs quietly or hit back with their own. And when both sides start taxing each other's goods, it quickly turns into a lose-lose. And guess what? It would be the American people who would be the worst affected, because when tariffs go up, the price tag on your everyday goods goes up. Naturally, people are concerned. The market's already on edge, but when asked if the crashing stock market was influencing any decisions, here's what Trump had to say.
Some of these temporary delays, have you been influencing those decisions because of the market reaction?
Well, there were no delays at all. No, nothing to do with the market. I'm not even looking at the market because long term, the United States will be very strong with what's happening here.
Trump did a similar thing in his last term. Not only did he kick off a full-blown trade war with China, but he also slapped global tariffs on steel and aluminum, renegotiated the North American Free Trade Agreement with Canada and Mexico, and even targeted the European Union with fresh duties. But that was just round one. Now he's back, and this time it's not just China. He's taking a hit at almost everyone. But why is Trump so obsessed with tariffs? Well, to understand that, you've got to meet the man he still calls his hero, President William McKinley. In one instance, Trump even claimed that in the 1890s, America was probably the wealthiest because of tariffs.
Our country in the 1890s was probably, Marcia, probably the wealthiest it ever was because it was a system of tariffs. And we had a president, McKinley, right? He was really a very good businessman, and he took in billions of dollars at the time, which today it's always trillions.
So it's no surprise that Trump sees tariffs as a smart, proven way to boost the economy. Truth be told, McKinley really did shake things up. This was back in the late 19th century, when the US was turning into an industrial giant. Steel mills were booming, railroads were spreading fast, and factories were popping up everywhere. It was the Gilded Age, a time of rapid growth, big fortunes, and just as much inequality between the rich and poor. And right in the middle of it was William McKinley, a congressman from Ohio. He believed that the best way to build up the US economy was to protect it by keeping cheaper foreign goods out. His thinking was simple: if you make imported products more expensive, people will buy American-made stuff instead. That way, local industries grow and American workers keep their jobs and earn better wages. So in 1890, he put this belief into action. McKinley authored the Tariff Act in 1890. Later, it became known as the McKinley Tariff. It raised import taxes to record highs, averaging around 50% on most goods, one of the highest tariff rates in U.S. history. Such a high wall of protection was nearly unheard of. It meant that foreign products would cost roughly half again as much when they entered American ports, giving domestic products a huge price advantage. The idea behind the McKinley Tariff was simple, and to the people who backed it, it made total sense. If foreign-made steel, textiles, or farm tools got more expensive because of high import taxes, then Americans would be more likely to buy stuff made at home. That would help American industries grow and create more jobs here. Back then, the U.S. was still playing catch-up with the big industrial powers in Europe, so the idea of protecting young industries sounded fair, especially to factory owners and workers in manufacturing-heavy states. At first, it actually looked like the plan was working. With fewer imports to compete with, American factories started making more. Business owners praised the tariff, saying it was helping local industry and building the economy. By the late 1880s, the U.S. economy was picking up speed, and supporters of the policy said the tariffs were the reason. McKinley even got nicknames like Napoleon of Protection and Tariff King because of how strongly he pushed for high import duties. It wasn't just about economics anymore. Tariffs became a core part of Republican politics. McKinley and his party claimed that this kind of protectionism was the reason America was getting stronger and richer. That same message later echoed in Trump's speeches over 100 years later. But the real impact of the Mckinley tariff wasn't so one-sided. Sure, manufacturers were happy, they had less foreign competition, but this wasn't the case for regular American people. For them, everyday items like clothing and sugar suddenly cost more, since the imported versions were heavily taxed. Even local products got pricier because US companies didn't have to compete as much and could charge more. Working families and farmers were hit the hardest. Farmers, in fact, suffered a double blow. They paid more for manufactured goods, and foreign countries retaliated by placing high tariffs on American farm exports like wheat, corn, and pork, making it harder for US farmers to sell abroad. The backlash came fast. 1890 was a congressional election year, and voters vented their frustration at the ballot box. The Mckinley tariff turned out to be widely unpopular. Just weeks after the tariff took effect, angry voters revolted against the Republicans who had backed it. William McKinley himself lost his seat in the House of Representatives. Republicans were thrown out of power in one of the biggest midterm defeats in U.S. history up to that point. The Democrats, who campaigned on lowering tariffs, took control of the House. But even with all the blowback, the idea of using tariffs to build national wealth didn't go away. And McKinley's political career was far from finished. In fact, he quickly bounced back. By 1896, McKinley was the Republican nominee for president, and he ran on the same old promise: prosperity through protectionism. In that campaign, he proudly called himself,
I am a tariff man standing on a tariff platform.
For McKinley, this election was about two clear choices: high tariffs to protect American jobs and industries, or low tariffs that, in his view, would wreck the economy. He argued that the recent depression, aka the Panic of 1893, was partly due to Democrats' decision to cut tariffs after his 1890 law was repealed. Whether that was fully true or not, it was a powerful argument, but politically, it worked, especially in industrial states. McKinley won the election, beating Democrat William Jennings Bryan, and walked into the White House at a time when the country was desperate for an economic comeback. McKinley and his Republican allies felt vindicated by their return to power, and, true to his word, McKinley wasted no time in re-establishing the protective wall. In 1897, he signed the Dingley Tariff Act into law, which pushed U.S. tariff rates even higher than before, almost back to the same levels as the original McKinley tariff. The Dingley tariff was, at the time, the highest tariff in American history. Its rates wouldn't be exceeded for many decades, until the 1930 Smoot-Hawley Act. We'll get to that soon. And for a while, the results looked solid. The economy bounced back from the Depression. Factories were back in full swing, and the country started exporting more than ever. Steel, machinery, and industrial goods were leaving American ports in huge numbers. By 1900, the U.S. had become the world's top industrial power. McKinley pointed to all of this as proof that his tariff policies worked, that America was, in his view, made rich and strong through protectionism. But even with all that success, new problems were starting to show. The same growth that tariffs had helped create now raised fresh questions. America was producing way more than the country could consume. Factories were churning out steel, oil, textiles, machinery more than ever before. To keep growing, they needed new buyers, and that meant looking outside the US. So industry leaders started demanding access to foreign markets to sell the surplus. But there was a problem. Other countries were still bitter about the high tariffs America had placed on their goods, and naturally, they weren't so eager to open up trade unless the US agreed to lower its own barriers. Without foreign buyers, that extra production risked dragging prices down and forcing factories to close. To keep the economy stable, the US needed to sell abroad. So the very strategy that had helped the US grow was now turning into a roadblock. At this point, McKinley was forced to reconsider the one-sided tariff strategy that had defined his career. Now, it might sound surprising, but William McKinley actually changed his mind. You see, at the same time, McKinley was facing severe political pressure. High tariffs had long fueled bitter fights between Republicans and Democrats. While Republicans defended them as good for business and national strength, Democrats said they raised costs for regular people and favored big industries over farmers and workers. McKinley had already seen what could happen when tariffs sparked public anger, like in 1890 when voters kicked many Republicans out of office. business, including him. He made a comeback, but he understood that pushing tariffs too far could carry political risks, especially if people felt the pain. Meanwhile, new ideas were gaining ground. Some of Mckinley's closest advisors, including Secretary of State John Hay, were pushing for more balanced trade deals. They supported something called reciprocity, where two countries agreed to lower tariffs for each other. The idea was to open new markets, and the mutual deals could help American exporters without fully abandoning the industries that still needed protection. You can actually see the start of McKinley's shift in the Dingley Tariff Act of 1897. Yes, it raised tariffs, but it also quietly gave the president the power to negotiate mutual tariff reductions of up to 20% with other countries. McKinley didn't rush to use this power, but just having it there showed that he was no longer sticking to the all-or-nothing approach of the past. The full extent of McKinley's conversion became clear in 1901, during his second term. In September of that year, President McKinley traveled to Buffalo, New York, to speak at the Pan American Exposition. It was meant to be a celebration of innovation and trade across the Western Hemisphere. There, on September 5th, McKinley delivered what would tragically be his final speech. He was shot by an assassin the next day. In that speech, McKinley astonished his audience by arguing for a new direction on trade. The period of exclusiveness is past, he said. It was a bold statement, especially from a man who had built his name on protecting American markets. He warned that commercial wars are unprofitable and pushed for goodwill and friendly trade relations to avoid retaliation from other nations. He openly supported reciprocity treaties, saying that they matched the spirit of the times, while retaliation and economic isolation did not. McKinley even admitted that some tariffs might no longer be necessary, and if they weren't, they could be reduced to help U.S. exporters reach global markets. These words, coming from McKinley, the champion of protection, were nothing short of remarkable. From this point on, McKinley no longer treated tariffs as untouchable. Instead, he saw them as flexible tools that might be adjusted or bargained with to achieve greater trade advantages. Another major influence on McKinley's shift was the belief that trade could build peace. In his final speech in Buffalo, he talked about friendly rivalry in global commerce and the need to exchange goods openly. Unfortunately, McKinley didn't get the chance to follow through, though. Just one day after giving that speech, he was shot by an assassin and died days later. His successor, Theodore Roosevelt, took up the presidency. Roosevelt was a Republican like McKinley. He brought a more progressive style to the White House and was open to many of the same trade ideas McKinley had just started to explore. Under Roosevelt and the presidents who followed, McKinley's late push for reciprocity began to take shape. The U.S. signed several trade deals, like an agreement with France and another attempted one with Canada, and held off on extreme tariff hikes, at least for a while. The significance of McKinley's change of heart cannot be overstated. This was a man once called the Napoleon of protection, now openly admitting that protectionism had its limits. His evolution showed that economic strategies can't stay frozen in time. What works during one phase of development might become harmful in the next. McKinley realized that once U.S. industries had grown strong, they didn't need the same level of protection. They needed access to global markets. This evolution in thinking set the stage for the 20th century. In the years after McKinley's death in 1901, U.S. tariff policy kept evolving. Sometimes slowly, sometimes with big shifts, depending on the economy and who was in power. Looking at this whole journey forward will help you understand whether Trump's recent trade actions are something entirely new or just history repeating itself. You see, Roosevelt actually supported the idea of reciprocity. One example was his treaty with Cuba, which lowered tariffs on Cuban sugar in exchange for reduced tariffs on U.S. exports. He also backed a similar deal with Canada, though that one didn't make it through Canada's parliament. But here's the problem. The rates set by the Dingley Act stayed in place. So despite some efforts at trade deals, the overall tariff levels remained high. The big cuts people expected never came. Everyday goods were still expensive, and the cost of living kept rising. The working class and farmers were especially hit hard. Progressives argued that the tariff system was helping monopolies and big manufacturers charge more while staying shielded from foreign competition. At the same time, other countries were still hitting back with their own tariffs, hurting American exports. Then came William Howard Taft. He became president in 1909 and immediately faced pressure to do something about tariffs. There was a massive demand from voters, reformers, and even some Republicans to finally do something about the high tariffs that were raising prices and fueling public frustration. That led to the Payne-Aldrich Tariff Act. Taft and the more progressive Republicans wanted to lower some duties and bring relief to consumers. But once the bill went through Congress, controlled by conservative, pro-tariff Republicans, it ended up keeping most rates high and even raised a few. The public wasn't happy. People had expected prices to drop, but they didn't. Tariff reformers were angry, and Taft lost support. The whole episode was such a mess that it played a big role in Theodore Roosevelt splitting from Taft and running against him in 1912, helping to divide the Republican Party. The 1912 election turned out to be a major turning point in U.S. trade policy. Democrat Woodrow Wilson won the presidency, and his party took control of Congress. That meant real change was finally possible. Wilson and the Democrats had long opposed high tariffs. They saw them as a burden on consumers. Once in power, they acted fast. In 1913, Congress passed the Underwood-Simmons Tariff Act, one of the most dramatic tariff reductions in U.S. history. Before this law, the average tariff on dutiable imports sat at around 40%. The new law brought that down to roughly 25%. That might not sound like much, but it was the steepest tariff cut the country had seen since before the Civil War. That's more than 50 years. YouTube just dropped a mind-boggling announcement. It's paying creators $64 million per day. Why? Well, because YouTube doesn't have enough creators. That's why you see videos on your homepage that have less than 1,000 views, like this one. Now, of course, that doesn't mean everyone should start a channel, but if you've ever wondered about starting a YouTube channel or faceless channel, now's a perfect time. YouTube's paying creators millions every day, and it's pushing newer, smaller channels now more than ever. But I'm sure you have many questions on how to start and grow a channel. We get questions in our email all the time from some of you guys. That's why we've decided to put all of our YouTube advice into one training bootcamp for completely free. So if you're someone interested in starting your own YouTube channel, you can sign up for this bootcamp by clicking the link in the description or on the screen. So sign up now, because unfortunately, unlike YouTube videos, the bootcamp's like a Zoom call, so it's limited to just 100 people. Now, back to the video. Specific items like wool, iron ore, steel rails, and food products saw major reductions or were removed from the tariff list entirely. Some goods were even made fully duty-free. But there was a catch. Tariffs had been the federal government's main source of revenue for more than a century. Slashing them so deeply meant the government needed a new way to pay its bills. And that's where the newly ratified 16th Amendment came in. It gave Congress the power to collect a federal income tax, and the Underwood Act included the first modern income tax law. The tax started modestly, just 1% on incomes over $3,000, and up to 7% on incomes over $500,000. Affecting only a small percentage of Americans at the time. Now, for the first time, the government had a stable revenue stream that didn't depend on taxing imports. And that gave lawmakers the freedom to pursue lower tariffs without risking a budget crisis. It also meant future tariff debates could focus more on the economic impact than on government funding needs. But the peace didn't last. World War I changed everything. Once the war ended, the US faced a new wave of economic challenges. European industries trying to rebuild started exporting again, this time more aggressively. American factories suddenly had new competition. At the same time, US farmers were in trouble. During the war, they'd ramped up production to feed Europe. But once the fighting stopped, demand dropped, prices crashed, and many farmers were left with unsold crops and mounting debt. That's when the push for protection came roaring back. In the early 1920s, the Republicans returned to power. Presidents Warren G. Harding and Calvin Coolidge took office, backed by business leaders, industrialists, and especially farmers demanding relief. The answer came in 1922 with the Fordney-McCumber Tariff Act. This law raised tariffs across the board, bringing them close to the high levels seen before the Underwood cuts. Average rates jumped back up nearly 38% on dutiable goods. But Fordney-McCumber also introduced something new. It gave the president authority through the Tariff Commission to adjust rates by up to 50% based on the difference in production costs between the US and its trading partners. This was one of the earliest steps toward what would later evolve into more formal reciprocal trade negotiations. In theory, this new flexibility allowed tariffs to be fine-tuned, but in practice, it mostly went one way: up. When American industries complained about cheap imports, tariffs were adjusted to protect them. These new tariffs were meant to help struggling sectors, especially farmers crushed by falling prices and manufacturers trying to compete with post-war European goods. And in the short term, it gave them some breathing room. But then new problems came running back. High tariffs made it harder for European nations to sell their products in the American market. That meant fewer dollars flowing back to Europe, dollars they desperately needed to repay war loans to the US. The tighter the trade barrier, the harder it became for those debts to be paid. This strained global economic ties and helped fuel resentment overseas. Still, throughout the 1920s, the US held firm. Tariff rates remained high, and the Republican Party continued to defend protectionism as key to national prosperity. Mckinley's early vision of shielding American industries from foreign competition was very much alive, even if his later ideas about openness and reciprocity were starting to gain ground in policy circles. The tension between protecting American jobs and opening markets abroad remained unresolved. The stage was being set for another major turning point. Next, let's take a look at the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930. Even today, this tariff act is seen as one of the worst economic decisions in U.S. history. You see, by the late 1920s, warning signs were flashing across the American economy. Farm incomes had been falling for years, industrial output was slowing down, and then in October 1929, the stock market collapsed. What followed was a chain reaction. Banks failed, credit dried up, businesses shut down, and unemployment skyrocketed. The Great Depression had begun. President Herbert Hoover campaigned in 1928, promising to support American agriculture, which had been in a slump even before the crash. The initial idea in Congress was to raise tariffs on farm products to help boost prices and protect American farmers from cheap foreign competition. However, once the tariff debate opened, it didn't stay limited to agriculture. Lobbyists from nearly every U.S. industry flooded in, demanding protection for their own goods. By the time the bill was finished, the number of items covered had ballooned to over 20,000. Tariffs were raised on not just farm products, but also on manufactured goods. Everything from tools and textiles to chemicals, glassware, and even canned goods. For some items, duties hit record highs, well above 60%. The bill had become a massive wall around the U.S. economy, driven more by lobbying power than sound economic reasoning. And yet, despite warnings from over 1,000 economists, business leaders, and even many in his own administration, President Hoover signed it into law in June 1930. Hoover wasn't completely on board with every part of the bill, but he felt cornered politically. He didn't want to alienate key parts of his base. Predictably, the results were disastrous. Canada, one of America's biggest trading partners, immediately imposed retaliatory tariffs on dozens of U.S. goods, including agricultural exports like apples, wheat, and livestock. France, Italy, Spain, Germany, and many others followed. In total, at least 25 countries raised their tariffs on American imports. What started as an effort to help U.S. farmers quickly turned into a global trade war. Between 1929 and 1933, global trade volumes dropped by roughly 66%. American exports fell by 60% in just a few years. Imports from Europe dropped from $1.3 billion in 1929 to $390 million by 1932. The U.S. lost access to key foreign markets just when it needed them most. Farmers who were already struggling saw their overseas customers vanish. Factory workers who were making goods for export lost their jobs. The Depression got deeper, unemployment soared, and Smoot-Hawley became a textbook example of how protectionism can go horribly wrong. By 1932, the country was in worse shape than ever, and Hoover was swept out of office in a landslide. The new president, Franklin D. Roosevelt, came in with a completely different vision. In 1934, just 2 years into his presidency, Roosevelt signed the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act, or RTAA, pushed by Secretary of State Cordell Hull. Hull was a committed free trader who believed that high tariffs had not only deepened the Depression, but also helped fuel international tensions. He saw trade as both a tool for economic recovery and peace. The RTAA broke from the past in a big way. For the first time, Congress gave the president authority to negotiate bilateral tariff reduction deals directly with other countries. These agreements didn't need to go back through the full congressional process every time. That flexibility made trade deals quicker and more responsive, and they weren't just one-sided cuts. The U.S. would lower tariffs only if the other country lowered theirs too, an approach that made the deals easier to sell politically. Within the first few years, the U.S. signed trade pacts with more than 20 countries, including Canada, Brazil, Belgium, and Sweden. These agreements didn't eliminate tariffs entirely, but they chipped away at the wall built by Smoot-Hawley. The average tariff rate on dutiable imports dropped from about 59% in 1932 to closer to 25% by the end of the 1930s. Most importantly, the shift signaled a change in mindset. The US government was moving away from isolation and recognizing that economic cooperation could be part of its long-term strategy. In Hull's view, countries that traded with each other were less likely to go to war, and given that this was the interwar period with global tensions rising again, that message resonated. Even though the Depression dragged on through the 1930s and World War II was around the corner, the RTAA laid the foundation for a more connected global economy. It started building trust between countries that trade could be mutually beneficial. When World War II broke out in 1939, the US was still officially neutral, but behind the scenes, it was already rethinking its role. American industries were gearing up for wartime production, and the US started selling military supplies and raw materials to allies under programs like Lend-Lease. This wasn't just about helping the war effort, it was also about keeping global trade networks alive. The US was starting to understand that it couldn't remain strong at home if the rest of the world was falling apart. Even during the war, Roosevelt's administration kept trade policy on the agenda. Hull continued negotiating trade agreements and laying the groundwork for what would come next. In 1941, the Atlantic Charter, signed by Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, outlined shared goals for the post-war world. One of those goals was freedom of trade. In 1944, as the war was nearing its end, world leaders met in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to plan the structure for the post-war global economy. And that's where the US helped establish the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, and the World Bank. But even then, tariffs and trade rules were still mostly handled separately. The groundwork for that would come in the next few years. All of this was building towards something bigger. The idea was no longer just about trade deals here and there. It was about preventing the economic chaos that had followed World War I, chaos that many believed had helped fuel fascism and war in the first place. US leaders didn't want to repeat that mistake. So by 1947, when the war was over and the world was trying to rebuild, the US stepped forward with a clearer vision. That year, it helped launch the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT, the first global framework for managing trade. Unlike earlier deals, GATT wasn't just bilateral. It brought dozens of countries together around shared rules, like gradual tariff cuts, fair treatment of foreign goods, and a system to negotiate future changes. GATT wasn't perfect because it had tons of loopholes, and at the same time, many developing countries felt left down. Still, it was a major step. It showed that the US now saw trade not just as a domestic issue, but as part of its leadership role in the world. The trauma of the Great Depression and the devastation of 2 world wars convinced many in Washington that stable trade could help build a stable world. Over the following decades, GATT expanded through rounds like Kennedy 1967, Tokyo 1979, and Uruguay 1994, eventually leading to the creation of the World Trade Organization. By the late 20th century, US average tariffs on industrial goods had dropped to under 5%. That's a massive fall from the nearly 50% rates under Mckinley just a century earlier. By now, the trade policy had shifted sharply towards liberalization. Free trade agreements, multilateral negotiations, and reduced trade barriers had become the new norm. Several nations are coming together to open markets to support economic growth and international stability. But that didn't mean tariffs disappeared. Far from it. Even in the height of the free trade era, the US kept certain defenses in place. Some sectors remained off-limits to full liberalization. For example, textiles and apparel were restricted for decades under the multi-fiber arrangement, a global system of quotas that managed clothing imports until the early 2000s. Agriculture stayed protected through a mix of high tariffs and subsidies, especially for politically sensitive products like sugar, dairy, and peanuts. These protections were often tied to domestic politics, rural voting blocs, lobbying from powerful industry groups, and the broader cultural narrative of preserving American farming. There were also legal tools baked into US trade laws that allowed tariffs to be turned on temporarily or selectively when needed. Anti-dumping duties were used when foreign producers were accused of selling goods below cost to undercut US industries. Countervailing duties offset the impact of foreign government subsidies. Safeguard tariffs could be triggered if a sudden import surge threatened serious injury to domestic producers. These tools didn't make headlines like broad tariffs did, but they were used frequently, and they made clear that even in a free trade era, protectionist levers were always ready to be pulled. Several US presidents used those levers when they faced political or economic pressure. Take 1971, for example. Inflation was rising, the trade deficit was widening, and the US dollar, then still tied to gold, was under strain. President Richard Nixon took drastic steps. In what became known as the Nixon shock, he suspended the dollar's convertibility to gold and slapped a surprise 10% surcharge, a tariff, on all imports. The goal was to force major trading partners, especially Japan and Western Europe, to adjust their currencies upward and make U.S. exports more competitive. And it worked, at least short term. Within months, key countries agreed to let their currencies rise under the Smithsonian Agreement. Nixon lifted the import surcharge just 4 months later. It was a blunt tactic, but one that showed even a free trading president could use tariffs to strong-arm economic change when needed. Interestingly, despite the disruption, trade talks didn't stop. New GATT negotiations followed in the 1970s. Then again, just a decade later, the 1980s was a time of serious tension between the US and Japan over trade. Japan's economy was booming and its exports were dominating global markets. Japanese cars were outselling American models. Their electronics were cheaper and better, and US manufacturers were losing market share fast. In response, Reagan negotiated what was called voluntary export restraints with Japan. These weren't official tariffs, but they worked the same way. Japan agreed to limit the number of cars it shipped to the US, which gave American automakers time to catch up. It was a way to ease domestic pressure without blowing up trade relations. In 1983, the iconic American motorcycle company Harley-Davidson was on the verge of collapse. It faced brutal competition from Japanese manufacturers, and the company filed a petition asking for help. Reagan responded by putting a 45% tariff on all imported heavyweight motorcycles. It was steep and targeted, but effective. Harley-Davidson recovered, modernized, and eventually requested the tariff to be lifted early. It was one of the rare success stories of temporary protection doing what it's supposed to do. But things got more serious in 1987, when Japan was caught violating a semiconductor trade agreement, and Reagan didn't hold back. He hit back hard, with 100% tariffs on $300 million worth of Japanese electronics, including TVs, computers, and power tools. The move got Japan's attention, and eventually the issue was resolved and the tariffs were lifted. Reagan talked a lot about open markets and competition, but when American industries were threatened, he showed he was willing to use hard measures. That's why some analysts later called him the most protectionist president since Hoover, not because he abandoned free trade, but because when push came to shove, he put political and economic pressure ahead of ideology. By the 1990s, the US was back to pushing hard for free trade. This was the era of NAFTA, the launch of the World Trade Organization, and the sweeping Uruguay round of GATT that slashed global tariffs even further. But even with all that momentum, the old habit of reaching for tariffs when politically useful didn't disappear. It just went quiet, waiting for the right moment to return. That moment came again under President George W. Bush, when the U.S. steel industry was struggling and political allies in Rust Belt states were calling for help. In 2002, Bush imposed temporary tariffs ranging from 8% to 30% on a wide range of steel imports. These were meant to last 3 years under a safeguard measure to give domestic producers time to modernize. Steelmakers welcomed it and labor unions backed it too, but the backlash was swift. The European Union and other trading partners lined up retaliatory tariffs, carefully aimed at politically sensitive U.S. exports, things like orange juice from Florida and auto parts from Michigan. Even the World Trade Organization ruled the U.S. steel tariffs illegal under global trade rules. Meanwhile, back at home, American manufacturers who depended on cheap steel, especially in the auto, appliance, and construction sectors, started to complain. They were now facing higher costs, shrinking margins, and job cuts of their own. Under pressure from both foreign governments and U.S. manufacturers, Bush scrapped the tariffs in late 2003, well before the 3-year plan was up. The political cost was rising, the economic backlash was real, and the legal pressure from the WTO added to it all. Later studies showed that while the steel manufacturing industry may have gained a few thousand jobs, the industries that relied on steel, like auto parts, construction, and machinery, took a big hit. Some estimates say that nearly 200,000 jobs were lost in those downstream sectors due to higher input costs. What was meant to be a short-term boost ended up hurting the broader economy. Once again, the US learned the hard way that even well-intended protectionist moves can backfire when the wider consequences aren't fully accounted for. In the years that followed, the US became more cautious about how and when to use them. Through the mid-2000s, America leaned deeper into free trade. New agreements were signed with countries like Australia, Singapore, Chile, and several across Central America. Talks were launched for even bigger deals like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which aimed to link major Pacific economies under one trade umbrella. This was to counterbalance China's rise and tie the US more tightly to global trade networks. But at the same time, the US companies had already spent decades building supply chains that stretched across continents. Products now sold in America were now often made from parts sourced in Mexico, assembled in China, and packaged in Vietnam. Tariffs in this setup weren't just taxes on foreign goods. They were disruptions to an interconnected system that American businesses had come to depend on. By the 2010s, it seemed like America had moved past the old battles over tariffs. The US had signed trade agreements with dozens of countries. It was one of the main voices in the World Trade Organization. Average tariffs were low, and global trade was a major part of the economy. For economists and policymakers, the idea of a full-blown trade war felt like something the country had moved beyond. But that assumption didn't last. Donald Trump's election hit the global trade system like a punch to the gut, because the guy didn't just question the status quo, he ran straight against it. While previous presidents talked about building trade alliances and opening new markets, Trump talked about pulling back, protecting domestic industries, and rewriting the rules. While past leaders saw tariffs as a last resort, something to use carefully, Trump treated them like his main weapon. And just like that, trade wars were back on the table. But if you zoom out, it actually fits a long-running pattern. Based on what we've said so far, you can see for yourself how the country's been swinging between protectionism and free trade for over a century. In tough times or under political pressure, the US has often leaned on tariffs to protect jobs or industries. In more stable periods, especially after World War II, it moved toward free trade, global cooperation, and lower barriers. But even in those free trade decades, tariffs never fully disappeared. They stayed in the background, ready to be used whenever an industry was in trouble or a foreign partner wasn't playing fair. Trump's approach, in many ways, was similar to pre-World War II policy. His belief was that the US, with its massive consumer market, held the upper hand. If other countries wanted to access American buyers, then the US could use that as leverage. That idea wasn't new. Presidents going back to Mckinley and even earlier believed in using market access as a bargaining chip. What made Trump different was how openly and aggressively he applied this logic in a globalized world. Now we live in a time where the global economy is far more interconnected than in McKinley's or even Reagan's time. So that brings us back to the main question. Were Trump's tariffs something new or just another round in America's long history of protectionist tariffs? In 2018, just a year into his presidency, Trump made his first big move. He invoked a rarely invoked clause, Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962. He declared that imported steel and aluminum posed a national security threat, that if U.S. steel and aluminum production collapsed, then it might jeopardize the country's ability to build ships, planes, or weapons in wartime. Based on that logic, the administration imposed a 25% tariff on steel and 10% on aluminum from most countries. What made this stand out was that it didn't spare close allies. Canada, Mexico, the European Union, South Korea, all were hit, at least initially. Eventually, some got exemptions or quotas, but the message was clear. No one got a free pass. This move looked a lot like Bush's 2002 steel tariffs, or even the late 19th century efforts to protect U.S. industries from foreign steel. And just like in the past, it had mixed results. U.S. steel mills saw an initial boost. Prices rose, capacity increased, and a few companies announced expansions or reopened plants. But downstream industries, the ones that use steel and aluminum, started to feel the heat. Car manufacturers, aerospace firms, appliance makers, and construction companies all faced higher input costs. Some passed those costs on to consumers, others cut back on hiring or investment. But that was just the start, and Trump was about to start a war with China. The U.S. trade deficit with China had become a political flashpoint, and Trump promised to hit back hard. Over the course of 2 years, his administration imposed tariffs on roughly $360 billion worth of Chinese goods in multiple waves. By 2019, about 2/3 of all U.S. imports from China were covered by new tariffs, ranging from 10% to 25%. These included everything from electronics and machinery to furniture, clothing, and toys. For everyday Americans, this meant higher prices on consumer goods. For retailers and importers, it meant scrambling to rework supply chains. So when a 25% tariff was placed on Chinese items, Chinese suppliers didn't suddenly drop their prices to keep US buyers happy. Instead, the cost was passed on. So if a product costs $100 before, it likely costs around $125 after the tariff hit. This pattern played out across thousands of goods, making many everyday items more expensive for American consumers. Trump often said, "China's paying us billions in tariffs." Technically, yes, tariff payments do go to the US Treasury, but they're paid by US companies at ports when the goods enter the country. Importers cut the checks, not Chinese exporters. And most importers didn't just absorb those costs. They passed them on in the form of higher retail prices, smaller product sizes, or fewer choices on shelves. Several economic studies tried to quantify the impact. One 2019 paper estimated the average US household was paying $400 to $800 more per year because of the tariffs, depending on income level and spending patterns. Another analysis accounting for all of Trump's tariffs, including those on steel, aluminum, washing machines, and products from allies, put the burden at over $1,200 per household annually. Back in 1890 under the Mckinley tariff, or in 1930 with the Smoot-Hawley, the same thing happened. Prices rose for consumers, but back then it was harder to quantify or track the effects in real time. Today, with detailed data and modeling tools, the cost of tariffs is easier to see and harder to deny. That said, it wasn't all downside. Just like in the past, some US industries gained from the protection. Steel and aluminum producers, for example, saw prices increase and boosted domestic capacity after the 2018 tariffs. A few even reopened plants or added jobs. Other sectors also benefited, particularly those that received specific targeted tariffs like washing machines and solar panels. Early in 2018, Trump imposed safeguard tariffs on both, separate from the China trade war. For companies like Whirlpool, which had long complained about low-cost imports from South Korea and China, this was a win. US production ramped up, and Whirlpool even expanded operations and added workers. It was one of the clearest examples of tariffs doing exactly what they were supposed to do, giving a domestic company temporary relief to regain ground. The solar industry, though, was more divided. US solar panel manufacturers supported the tariffs as they helped them compete with heavily subsidized Chinese panels. But solar installers who rely on cheap panels to keep project costs low pushed back. For them, tariffs meant slower growth and higher installation prices. But even these success stories weren't as straightforward as they seemed. You see, when the steel and aluminum tariffs kicked in, that raised the cost of raw materials for Whirlpool, since washing machines are mostly steel, and the company responded by raising its prices. The average price of a washing machine in the US went up by around 20%, which translated to roughly $82 more per unit for consumers. Multiply that by millions of machines sold, and the total consumer cost far outweighed the gains from those added jobs. Economists ran the numbers and found that for each new job created in washing machine manufacturing, consumers paid more than $800,000 in higher prices. In other words, the government achieved a concentrated win for a specific company and industry, but at an enormous diffuse cost spread across millions of households. Meanwhile, China didn't take it quietly. Beijing responded with tariffs of its own. They started targeting US exports. US soybean exports to China were the biggest market, but it soon fell by about 75% in 2018. China simply turned to Brazil, who quickly filled the gap. Soybeans piled up in American silos, prices dropped, farm incomes plunged, and the ripple effect spread across the Midwest. Pork producers and corn farmers faced similar losses. These hits were strategic, aimed directly at Trump's political base in rural and farming regions. US farmers were hit especially hard. Some lost key buyers overnight. Others saw crop prices crash. To avoid a political disaster, especially heading into the 2018 midterms, the Trump administration rolled out a massive bailout. About $28 billion in federal aid to farmers over 2018 and 2019. That made it one of the largest agricultural subsidy packages in US history. This wasn't part of a long-term farm bill or budget plan. It was direct compensation for trade war damages, a way to keep key states from flipping politically. But here's the irony. The money came from the tariffs Americans had paid. A later analysis found that 92% of the tariff revenue collected from Chinese imports was paid right back to the US farmers as trade relief. So, American consumers and companies paid higher prices for goods, that money went to the US Treasury, and then it was used to compensate the farmers who lost their customers because of the tariffs. Even this back and forth between the United States and China was similar to the Smoot-Hawley dynamic of the 1930s. One side imposes tariffs, the other side retaliates, and both sides suffer. Studies from the Federal Reserve, academic economists, and even members of Trump's own economic team consistently found that U.S. importers and eventually consumers bore nearly the full cost of the tariffs. That raises the bigger question. What did Trump's tariffs actually achieve? The answer to this is complicated. Trump saw tariffs as a tool, a means to pressure countries, especially China, into making concessions. That's how we got the Phase 1 trade deal in early 2020. China agreed to ramp up its purchases of U.S. goods, especially farm products, energy, and manufacturing, and promised better protections for intellectual property and some limited market reforms. China agreed to ramp up its purchases of U.S. goods, especially farm products, energy, and manufacturing, and promised better protections for intellectual property and some limited market reforms. In exchange, the U.S. called off some planned tariff hikes and made small reductions on a portion of the goods already under tariff. But the bulk of Trump's tariffs stayed in place. But did it work? Only partially. China did buy more U.S. goods, especially soybeans and pork, giving some short-term relief to farmers. But it fell well short of the promised targets. The COVID-19 pandemic disrupted trade, but even without that, many of the deeper structural issues like state subsidies and tech transfer rules were left untouched. Phase 2 never happened. What made this different from something like Nixon's 1971 tariff shock is that Nixon removed his tariffs quickly once he got a deal. Trump didn't. His tariffs became more of a permanent fixture, not just leverage. And even after he left office, President Biden kept most of those tariffs intact, proof that once they're in place, rolling them back is politically risky. They start to stick. Just like many of the old 19th century tariffs that stayed long after their original purpose faded. Another modern aspect that complicated Trump's tariffs was the way the supply chain worked. In Mckinley's time, supply chains were relatively simple, but in these modern times, most American companies have deep international supply networks, especially those involving China. So when tariffs hit in 2018, these companies had to adapt quickly. Some importers tried to trade dodge by shifting production to other countries. For example, firms moved some manufacturing from China to Vietnam, Thailand, or Mexico to avoid tariffs. While this reduced direct imports from China, it didn't directly mean more production in the US. It often meant reshuffling to other foreign suppliers. This is where Trump's tariffs hit a wall that Mckinley never faced. Back then, industries were mostly domestic. Today, they're global. Pulling one thread can unravel entire supply chains. For small and mid-sized US businesses, the disruption was brutal. New suppliers had to be found, logistics reworked, and costs went up. Even when companies eventually adapted, many never went back to Chinese suppliers. The tariffs effectively accelerated a slow decoupling between the US and China in certain sectors. Some say that's a good thing, less dependence on a strategic rival. Others point to the inefficiencies and higher costs as long-term damage. As for winners and losers, steel mills and aluminum plants saw temporary gains. A few appliance and solar panel factories got breathing room. Furniture and textile manufacturers, long struggling against cheap imports, also benefited. But farmers, already at the mercy of weather and commodity markets, were hammered by China's retaliation. They had to rely on government bailouts to stay afloat. Consumers paid more for thousands of everyday goods. Retailers, especially smaller ones, struggled with thinner margins, and U.S. manufacturers that relied on Chinese parts or machinery faced rising costs and planning headaches. Another less obvious casualty was the global trade system itself. Trump's use of tariffs on allies like Canada and the EU under the banner of national security shocked even friendly nations. Canada claimed that a security threat over steel was outrageous. Trade partners began reconsidering their own trade strategies. Some, like the EU, explored new protectionist tools or sought trade deals without the US. Trust in America's role as a stable trade partner took a hit. Even though deals like the revised NAFTA eventually helped ease tensions, the damage was already done. Yet politically, Trump's message was a massive success. Many blue-collar workers felt heard and supported his tough trade stance. Even some labor unions, usually allied with Democrats, praised parts of his trade policy. And Trump didn't stop at trade. In 2019, he also threatened to slap tariffs on all Mexican imports unless Mexico cracked down on border crossings. Mexico, fearing a collapse in its export-driven economy, quickly agreed to send more troops to stop migrants. It worked, at least in the short term, but it blurred the line between trade policy and foreign policy in ways that made economists and businesses uneasy. Mckinley never used tariffs this way. Trump was using them as a geopolitical weapon, not just a trade tool. So, did they work? Well, if the goal was to shrink the US trade deficit, then no. Because the overall number didn't budge. It actually hit new highs during Trump's presidency, partly because the US economy was strong and still sucking in imports. The deficit with China shrank, but trade deficits with other countries widened. If the goal was to revive American manufacturing, then maybe. Because there was a modest bump in factory jobs in 2018, but not a major resurgence. By 2019, manufacturing was already slowing again, partly due to higher costs and trade uncertainty. If the goal was to force structural change in China, then the result was mixed. Some concessions were made, but the core issues still remained. And the relationship between the two countries turned far more confrontational. And lastly, if the goal was to change the way America thinks about trade, then yes, it worked. Both parties are now more cautious about free trade. There's broader support for protecting strategic industries. Even Democrats who once championed trade liberalization are now talking about fair trade and reshoring. In that sense, Trump's tariffs shifted the political consensus, much like other historical trade shocks have done.